Imagine being stranded in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by an abyss of darkness so complete that even your shadow abandons you. Now picture this. Something is watching you, hidden in the black void, its presence chilling, its intentions unknown. This is the story of a routine trip that turned into a descent into the unexplainable, a night that still haunts the memories of those who lived it. What you're about to hear isn't a tale from a book or a scene from a movie, it's real. A first-hand account of an encounter so terrifying that it defies logic and leaves you questioning what truly exists in the unseen corners of our world. Before we begin, a warning. This story will linger in your mind long after you've finished listening. If you're drawn to stories that challenge reality and send shivers down your spine, subscribe to Sinister Stories now. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of the mysteries we unravel here. And prepare yourself, because what lies ahead is a dark journey into the unknown, one that will make you think twice about venturing down an empty road at night. The story begins innocently enough: a truck, a delivery, and a vast stretch of highway. The kind of job thousands of drivers complete every day without incident. But this trip was different. The isolation of the road was suffocating, the stars above offered no comfort, and the silence was unnervingly loud. The air itself seemed heavier, pressing down as if warning them to turn back. They didn't listen, and that's when everything changed. Stay with me, because this isn't just a story. It's a haunting reminder that the unknown isn't always hiding. It's waiting, watching, and sometimes it's closer than you think. Do you believe in the supernatural? By the end of this video, you just might. The highway stretched endlessly into the abyss, cutting through a wilderness that seemed to devour the faintest glimmers of light. No street lamps marked the way, no comforting glow of distant towns. Instead, only the pale silver of distant stars illuminated the landscape, casting eerie shadows across the desolate road. The air was cold, unnaturally still, as though the world had been momentarily paused, leaving only the hum of the truck engine to fill the oppressive silence. This wasn't their usual route. It was a shortcut, one meant to save time. But as the hours dragged on and the road remained unchanging, the decision to veer off course began to feel like a mistake. Dense vegetation lined the asphalt, a tangle of gnarled trees and undergrowth so thick it created a wall of shadows. Occasionally, the truck's headlights would catch glimpses of the foliage, a flash of twisted branches, leaves shivering without a breeze, as if the forest itself were alive and watching. The truck began to falter as night claimed the sky. Steam hissed from under the hood during every stop, and the engine groaned like a wounded animal. With each pause, the isolation grew more oppressive. The faint sounds of the wild, chirps, rustles, the distant hoot of an owl, faded entirely. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. And in that unnatural quiet, a sense of unease began to creep in, subtle but undeniable, like a shadow flickering at the edge of sight. When the engine finally died, leaving them stranded in utter darkness, the silence became deafening. The road disappeared into a void ahead and behind, swallowed by the night. The vegetation seemed to inch closer, the darkness pressing against the truck as though eager to claim it. It wasn't just the lack of light or the absence of sound that made the air so heavy. It was the feeling, the unsettling certainty that they were not alone. My partner stepped out first, flashlight in hand, his breath visible in the cold air. The beam of light sliced through the dark, revealing nothing but an endless sea of black trees and shrubs. He muttered under his breath, heading to the back of the truck to figure out a solution, while I stayed near the cab, gripping my phone like a lifeline. That's when I felt it. Something out there, just beyond the reach of the headlights. The sense of being watched, intensely, persistently. I turned toward the vegetation, scanning for movement, but there was nothing. Just the shadows, thick and impenetrable. Yet the sensation grew stronger, a presence that seemed to wrap itself around me, cold and unwelcome. The forest, once silent, now seemed to hum faintly with an unnatural energy, a low vibration that crawled under my skin. Whatever was out there, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't benign. The road was no longer just a stretch of asphalt. It had become a boundary, a fragile line separating safety from the unknown. And as the night deepened, that line felt thinner and thinner, ready to dissolve completely. We had crossed into a place where reason held no power, where the familiar laws of reality didn't seem to apply. Something was out there, waiting, hidden in the shadows. And soon it would make itself known. It began subtly, like a whisper in a silent room, a sensation so faint that I almost ignored it. Standing near the cab of the truck, I heard the first sound, a faint rustling in the bushes. At first, I dismissed it as an animal, a harmless creature moving through the undergrowth. But the sound grew louder, sharper, and more deliberate, as though something, or someone, was navigating the dense vegetation with a purpose. I strained my eyes against the darkness, but the flashlight only seemed to highlight how little I could see. Then came the stones. One rolled across the asphalt, coming to a stop at my feet. I froze, staring at it. A second later, another stone followed, as if it had been tossed deliberately. My chest tightened. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice trembling, the sound swallowed instantly by the oppressive night. There was no response, just an unsettling silence that seemed to mock my attempt to rationalize what was happening. I turned on my phone's flashlight and pointed it toward the bushes. The light cut through the dark in sharp, narrow beams, illuminating leaves and branches, but revealing nothing else. My heart raced, the pounding in my chest loud enough to drown out my thoughts. Just as I lowered the light, there it was again, a faint, rapid movement deep within the brush, followed by the sound of something heavy shifting. The stones kept coming, one after another, their soft clinking against the road unnervingly rhythmic. I crouched, reaching for one of the stones, hoping to find a clue, but they were just ordinary rocks, cold and smooth to the touch. Yet their very presence felt wrong. Who, or what, was throwing them? The thought gnawed at me, each unanswered question feeding the growing knot of fear in my stomach. A sudden chill swept over me, sharp and biting, though the night had already been cold. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from the weather. It felt alive, a deep, unnatural freeze that settled in my bones. The air itself seemed to shift, carrying with it a faint, acrid scent that made my nose wrinkle and my stomach churn. It was the smell of something decayed, something old and forgotten. I heard it then, a soft but distinct sound like breathing coming from the bushes. It was uneven, labored, and uncomfortably close. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I aimed it back toward the vegetation. The light caught the edge of movement, branches swaying slightly, though there was no wind. My breath caught in my throat, every muscle in my body tensed, as the breathing grew louder, raspier, closer. I took a step back, my pulse hammering in my ears. As I turned toward the truck, I felt the weight of eyes on me, heavy and unrelenting, like a predator sizing up its prey. It was then that I knew, whatever was out there wasn't just watching, it was waiting. Waiting for something. When my partner appeared from the back of the truck, his sudden presence startled me, breaking the suffocating tension for a brief moment. He was pale, his face drawn tight with unease. "We need to go," he said, his voice low and urgent. His eyes darted toward the bushes as though he too had felt it. The engine had miraculously started again, but neither of us questioned the timing. We climbed into the cab without another word, the silence between us louder than any scream. As we pulled away, the stones stopped. The rustling ceased, but the feeling remained, lingering like a shadow. Even as the truck rumbled down the road, I couldn't shake the sense that something was still out there, watching us leave. Its presence burned into the darkness like an afterimage. Whatever it was, it had let us go for now. But the question that haunted me was, why? As the truck rolled into motion, the unease in the air didn't dissipate, it thickened. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, their beams swallowed by the void beyond the road. I glanced at my partner, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, his eyes locked on the road ahead, but darting to the mirrors every few seconds. He wasn't just driving, he was running, as if the truck's wheels could carry us far enough to escape whatever lurked in that suffocating night. But for me, the fear wasn't something we could outrun. My mind replayed the falling stones, the unseen movements in the bushes, and the low, raspy breathing that seemed far too human, yet entirely unnatural. Questions crowded my thoughts, each one more unsettling than the last. What had been out there? And why hadn't it revealed itself completely? A part of me was desperate for answers, but another part, the one that gripped my chest like a vice, knew that answers might be worse than ignorance. My partner broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you hear anything?" he asked, his tone strained, as if he already knew the answer but didn't want to hear it. I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "There were stones," I replied finally, my voice trembling. "Someone or something was throwing them. And I heard breathing. Close." His jaw tightened, and his grip on the wheel grew firmer. "We shouldn't have stopped there," he muttered, more to himself than to me. That's when the engine sputtered again, jolting the truck as though it was fighting to keep moving. The faint hum of the motor wavered, threatening to give out. My heart dropped. I could feel the fear clawing at me, raw and insistent. I glanced out the window, expecting to see nothing but trees and darkness, but the shadows seemed different now, closer, heavier, like they were pressing in on us. When the truck jerked to a halt, silence filled the cab, deafening and oppressive. My partner cursed under his breath and reached for the flashlight, opening the door with a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. "Stay here," he ordered, but the command was more of a plea. I nodded, clutching my phone tightly, its weak light feeling useless against the enormity of the darkness around us. The minutes stretched endlessly as I waited alone. My breath fogged up the window as I stared out, searching for any sign of my partner or the source of the ominous presence that seemed to surround us. A noise broke the stillness, soft at first, then louder, a scraping sound, like metal dragging against stone. My eyes darted to the side mirror, but all I saw was black. My fingers hovered over the door handle, torn between staying inside the cab and stepping into the unknown to find my partner. That's when I felt it again, the oppressive weight of being watched. But this time it was different, more focused, more deliberate. The air inside the cab grew cold, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones and numbs your thoughts. I turned slowly, my gaze drawn to the windshield. There, just beyond the faint glow of the headlights, something moved. The figure was indistinct, shrouded in shadows so deep they seemed to ripple like smoke. It wasn't human, though it stood upright. Its form was wrong, too large, too angular, as though it had been shaped from nightmares rather than flesh. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its gaze, piercing and unrelenting, as though it could see straight through me. My partner's voice shattered the moment, calling out from behind the truck. "Get in! It's running again!" he shouted, his words laced with urgency. I fumbled with the door handle, my hands trembling, and climbed into the passenger seat as fast as I could. He slammed the door shut and hit the accelerator, the truck roaring to life as we sped into the night. The silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken terror. My partner's eyes never left the road, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands shook against the wheel. "What did you see?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. He didn't answer, not at first. But after a long moment, he whispered, "Something that doesn't belong in this world." The truck barreled down the road, the shadows in the mirrors stretching and twisting as if they were chasing us. I kept my eyes forward, too afraid to look back. The choice to leave had been made, but the question lingered in my mind. Had we escaped? Or had we only bought ourselves more time? As the truck tore down the road, the oppressive darkness outside seemed to thicken, swallowing everything beyond the narrow beams of the headlights. The sense of dread that had been a quiet murmur in the back of my mind now roared like an unrelenting storm. My partner's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale, his breath shallow. Neither of us spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with a presence, an unseen force that felt closer with every passing second. And then the engine faltered. The truck shuddered violently before slowing to an agonizing halt. The headlights flickered, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The silence of the night returned, but it was no longer merely quiet. It was a suffocating void. I could feel it pressing down on us, a weight that grew heavier with every breath. My partner swore under his breath, hitting the dashboard in frustration, but his frustration couldn't mask the fear in his voice. "We have to get out and check it again," he said reluctantly, his eyes darting to the side mirrors, scanning the darkness. I wanted to protest, to beg him to stay inside, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded, clutching my phone tightly as we both stepped out into the chilling night. The air was different now. It wasn't just cold, it was alive. A low hum vibrated through the ground, faint but palpable, as if the earth itself was resonating with some unseen energy. I stood by the cab, shining my flashlight toward the trees, but the beam seemed weaker, as if the darkness was consuming it. My partner moved to the back of the truck, his own flashlight bobbing as he inspected the engine. Then it happened. A sound, low and guttural, like a deep growl, rumbled through the stillness. It wasn't an animal sound, nor was it human. It was something in between, a twisted hybrid that sent shivers racing down my spine. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the growl deepened, vibrating in the air around us. My partner heard it too. He stopped moving, his flashlight trembling as he pointed it toward the trees. Something was there. The shadows shifted unnaturally, coalescing into a form that defied logic. It moved with an eerie fluidity, stepping just into the edge of the light. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was dark and leathery, glistening faintly under the weak light. Its head was adorned with curved horns that framed a face obscured by shadow, save for its eyes, two glowing orbs of crimson that burned with an intensity that felt like they were drilling into my very soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The thing stared at us, unblinking, its presence radiating an aura of pure malice. My partner, his voice barely above a whisper, muttered, "Don't move." But it didn't matter. I could feel that it already knew everything about us, our fear, our desperation. We were trapped. The growl turned into a low, guttural laugh, a sound that reverberated through the night like nails scraping against metal. It stepped closer, its movements deliberate, predatory. My partner stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight, the beam spinning wildly as it hit the ground. I grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the truck, my voice finally breaking free in a panicked cry. "Get in. Now!" We scrambled into the cab, slamming the doors shut just as the creature reached the edge of the road. My partner turned the key, the engine sputtering once, twice, before roaring to life. The creature didn't move to stop us. It simply stood there, watching, its burning eyes following us as the truck roared forward. But as we sped away, a chilling realization settled over me. It hadn't chased us because it didn't need to. Whatever that thing was, it had left its mark. The shadows outside the truck seemed to pulse and shift, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still with us, lingering just beyond the edges of the headlights, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the road stretched ahead, I glanced at my partner. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. Neither of us spoke, but the silence between us was deafening. We hadn't escaped. We had simply been allowed to leave, for now. And the question that haunted me was whether we had taken something with us, or left a piece of ourselves behind. The truck raced through the darkness, but the air inside the cab was suffocating, heavy with fear and silence. My partner's eyes were glued to the road, his face a pale mask of dread. I couldn't stop glancing in the mirrors, expecting to see something, anything, lurking just beyond the glow of the taillights. The creature's image was burned into my mind, its unnatural form, its glowing red eyes, and the guttural sound of its laugh that seemed to echo even now. Then, the radio crackled to life. It was faint at first, just static, but it quickly became something more, a low, distorted voice that sent chills racing down my spine. The words were unintelligible, warped and broken, but there was a cadence to them, a rhythm that felt almost like a chant. My partner reached out with a shaking hand to turn it off, but the knob refused to budge. The voice grew louder, more insistent, filling the cab with an unholy presence. As we sped on, the lights on the dashboard flickered erratically. The headlights dimmed, and the darkness outside seemed to press closer, as if the night itself was alive and hungry. The road ahead began to change, subtly at first, but unmistakably. The asphalt cracked and splintered, and the surrounding trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches curling like skeletal fingers. It felt like we were no longer on the same road, as though we'd been pulled into another place, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. I looked at my partner, his face now drenched in sweat, his breathing shallow and erratic. "What's happening?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, but his eyes darted to the mirrors, then back to the road, over and over again. I turned to look out my window, and that's when I saw it, a shadow moving alongside the truck. It wasn't running or flying. It simply glided, keeping pace effortlessly. The shadow shifted and twisted until it began to take form. The creature's outline became visible once more, its horns silhouetted against the unnatural darkness. It didn't look at me directly, but I could feel its gaze, cold and invasive, peeling away every layer of courage I had left. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence and the faint hum of the truck's engine. But the relief was short-lived. The distorted voice on the radio changed, growing clearer. This time, it spoke directly to us. "You saw me," it rasped, the words dragging out as if spoken through broken glass. "And now, I see you." The truck jolted violently, the tires screeching as though they were resisting the road itself. My partner struggled to maintain control, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly I thought it might snap. The radio voice continued, mocking, its tone dripping with malice. "There's no escape. You're mine now." And then everything stopped. The truck came to an abrupt halt, the engine dead, the lights extinguished. We were plunged into complete darkness. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that wraps around you and amplifies your fear. I fumbled for my phone, its faint light casting eerie shadows inside the cab. My partner sat frozen, his face pale and drenched with sweat. That's when I saw it. Written across the fogged-up windshield were words, scrawled as if by an unseen hand. "This is only the beginning." My blood turned to ice as I reached out to touch the words, but they vanished before my fingers made contact, as though they had never been there. My partner snapped out of his paralysis, desperately trying to restart the engine. It roared to life after several agonizing seconds, the headlights flickering back on. As we drove away, the road began to return to normal. The trees straightened, the asphalt smoothed, and the suffocating presence lifted, but not completely. We didn't speak. What was there to say? We both knew the truth. The creature hadn't been left behind. It was with us, lurking in the shadows, its grip on us unrelenting. In that moment, a horrifying realization settled over me. This wasn't just an encounter with the unknown. It was a warning. Whatever had crossed our path that night wasn't done with us. It had marked us, claimed us, and the words on the windshield weren't a threat, they were a promise. Even now, as I sit here recounting this story, I can feel its presence, faint but undeniable, watching from the edges of the light. It's waiting, and someday it will return. The truck sped down the road, but the sense of relief we both desperately craved never came. Even as the surroundings returned to normal, the asphalt smooth and dark, the trees straight and still, the air inside the cab was thick with a dread that refused to lift. My partner's hands trembled as they gripped the wheel, his knuckles white against the vibrating leather. I sat silently, staring out the window, but all I could see was the creature's burning red eyes, seared into my memory like an eternal scar. Neither of us spoke. The weight of what had just happened was too much to process. It felt like breaking the silence would somehow invite it back, as though words could summon the darkness that had almost swallowed us whole. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but no matter how far we drove, it felt as if we weren't moving forward. The journey home became surreal, as if we were trapped in an endless loop, destined to relive that night forever. When we finally reached the safety of city lights, the contrast was jarring. The warm glow of streetlights and the distant hum of civilization felt alien after the suffocating darkness of the road. My partner parked the truck in silence, turning off the engine and leaning back in his seat. He stared at the dashboard for what felt like an eternity, his breath shallow and uneven. I broke the silence first, my voice trembling. "What was that?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered. He finally turned to me, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a fear I'd never seen before. "I don't know," he whispered. "But whatever it wasn't meant to be seen." We unloaded the truck in near silence, moving mechanically, our minds elsewhere. The delivery site was bustling with workers, their casual chatter and laughter a stark contrast to the suffocating terror we had just escaped. It felt wrong, surreal, as if the normalcy of the world couldn't possibly exist after what we had experienced. But the nightmare wasn't over. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something etched into the side of the truck. My blood ran cold as I leaned closer, tracing the jagged marks with trembling fingers. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. A single word, carved deep into the metal, mine. I stumbled backward, my breath hitching in my throat. My partner saw it too, his face twisting in a mixture of fear and disbelief. "We need to go," he said urgently, his voice cracking. Without another word, we climbed back into the truck, our movements hurried and clumsy. The drive home was quiet, but the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, heavy with the knowledge that we couldn't escape what had happened. The shadows that flickered in the corners of my vision felt alive, shifting and twisting as if they carried the weight of the thing we had encountered. When we finally arrived, the safety of home didn't feel as comforting as I'd hoped. My partner dropped me off, his parting words haunting me long after he drove away. "Don't talk about it," he said. "Just don't." I tried to move on, to push the experience to the back of my mind, but it lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. The nights became the hardest. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows felt like a whisper from that dark road. Sleep was fleeting, and when it came, it was filled with dreams of glowing red eyes and guttural laughter echoing through the void. Weeks passed, but the fear never left. One night, as I sat alone in my room, the power flickered. For a brief moment, the room was plunged into darkness, and in that split second, I felt it again, that same cold presence, watching, waiting. When the lights came back on, the room was empty, but on the fogged-up window, a message appeared, written as if by an unseen hand. "You can't run forever." Even now, I live in the shadow of that night. I don't know what we encountered, and I don't think I ever will. But one thing is certain, it's still out there, waiting, watching, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants. The days following the encounter felt surreal, as if I were walking through a haze. The normalcy of everyday life was a cruel contrast to the terror that had gripped us on that desolate road. My partner and I stopped speaking about it entirely, as though acknowledging it would give it power, or worse, call it back. But silence wasn't enough to shake the feeling that we hadn't truly left it behind. At first, I tried to convince myself it was over. The truck was repaired, the delivery completed, and life seemed to move forward. But the mark it left on me was deeper than I'd realized. It wasn't just fear, it was a shadow that lingered, an intangible presence that followed me, always just out of sight. At night, the house felt different, colder. The air carried a heaviness that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Then came the dreams. They weren't the fragmented, nonsensical images of ordinary nightmares. They were vivid, suffocating, and horrifyingly real. In my dreams, I was back on that road. The truck was broken down, the darkness was alive, and the creature was there, waiting in the shadows. Its glowing red eyes burned into my soul, and its guttural laughter echoed endlessly. But the worst part wasn't seeing it. It was the feeling that I couldn't move, couldn't escape, as it crept closer and closer. Each morning, I woke drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the dream's terror clinging to me like a second skin. And each time, I found something small, something that shouldn't have been there. A faint scratch on the window, a cold stone resting on the porch, or once, a single word written in the condensation on my bathroom mirror. Soon, the fear began to consume me, invading every aspect of my life. I avoided driving at night, terrified of finding myself on another lonely stretch of road. Even during the day, I found myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those eyes watching me from the shadows. My partner wasn't faring any better. He quit his job and moved to another town, cutting off all contact. The last thing he said to me before disappearing was, "It's still with us. It's just waiting." I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion, or an elaborate trick of the mind. But no explanation could erase the fear that had burrowed into my very being. The creature, whatever it was, had left a mark on us, and that mark wasn't fading. One night, weeks after the encounter, I decided to write it all down, hoping that putting the experience into words might help me make sense of it. But as I typed, the memories became sharper, more vivid, as though reliving them was pulling me closer to that night. And then the lights flickered. The room went dark for just a moment, but in that moment, I felt it again, that suffocating presence, the cold that seeped into my bones. When the lights came back on, I froze. On the screen of my laptop, a message had appeared, typed out in jagged letters I hadn't written. "I see you." I slammed the laptop shut, my heart racing. The air around me was still, but it felt charged, alive. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid of what might come next. Since then, the signs have been sporadic but unrelenting. Shadows that move when they shouldn't. Whispers that echo in empty rooms. And always the feeling of being watched. Whatever we encountered on that road didn't just let us go, it followed us. It's waiting, lurking at the edges of the light, ready to step forward when the time is right. I've come to accept that I may never truly escape it. It's part of me now, woven into the fabric of my life. And every time I close my eyes, I wonder if this will be the night it finally takes me back to that road, back to the darkness where it waits. If you've ever felt the presence of something unexplainable, something that doesn't belong in this world, be careful. Sometimes, when you look into the shadows, they look back. And once they see you, they never forget.